Romania's dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, came to power promising a new beginning for the country. But he inherited the dark legacy built on years of cruelty and fear, especially toward women. Instead of ending it, he made it worse. Thousands of women lived through a nightmare that still leaves scars today. The violence, which had been going on long before Nicolae came to power, started after World War II, when Romania came under Soviet influence. The monarchy was abolished on December 30th, 1947. The old world of kings and free thought disappeared almost overnight. The Communist Party, backed by the Soviet Union, promised to modernize Romania. But instead of freedom, it delivered silence. By 1948, the country was blanketed by a web of surveillance. That same year, the regime created the Securitate, the secret police force that would soon become one of the most feared in Eastern Europe. Their job wasn't to protect citizens. It was to root out enemies of the state, a label that could fall on anyone who dared to question, speak, or even think freely. At first, their targets were predictable, including political opponents, former soldiers, priests, teachers, and intellectuals. But as the paranoia deepened, the net widened. Women who had once been overlooked in political struggles were suddenly viewed as potential threats too. Some were accused of hiding their husbands who had joined anti-communist resistance groups in the mountains. Others were simply denounced by jealous neighbors or co-workers. No one was safe. In the countryside, land that had belonged to families for generations was taken away. Women were forced into state-run collective farms, expected to labor for the people's cause. But this new system stripped them of everything personal, including their homes, their freedom, and their voices. Every aspect of their lives was dictated by the regime, from what they grew to how they lived. Even their bodies were under state control. Women's health and motherhood became political tools. The government began to see female bodies as factories for producing loyal citizens. And that mindset set the stage for decades of brutal policies that would define Romania under communism. Fear became part of daily life. The new regime didn't just silence women, it crushed them, body and soul. One of the first victims of this cruelty was Adriana Georgescu Cosmovici, born in 1920 in Bucharest. She was educated, confident, and full of hope for her country. She studied law and worked with democratic leaders before the communists took over. In the eyes of the new regime, educated women who had ties to the old government were dangerous. They represented the world Romania had lost, one where people could speak freely and think for themselves. In July 1945, Adriana was arrested by the Securitate, accused of plotting against the new social order. But her real crime was refusing to submit. Inside the cold, windowless interrogation rooms, she faced unimaginable violence. The guards didn't just want information, they wanted to break her. She was beaten, mocked, and sexually assaulted. Every act of torture was meant to erase her dignity and force her into silence. By September 1945, she was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Her story became one of the earliest examples of how Romania's new rulers treated women. But Adriana wasn't the only one. In the countryside, another woman was fighting her own battle. Elisabeta Rizea, born in 1912 in the small village of Domnești, had no political power, no high education, and no protection. Yet she refused to accept the government's plan to take away her family's land and force everyone into collective farms. When the communists began seizing property in her region, she joined the local resistance, helping guerrilla fighters who hid in the mountains and opposed the regime. For years, Elisabeta secretly brought them food, clothes, and messages, knowing that being caught meant death. In 1952, the Securitate finally found her. She was dragged from her home and sent to Pitești prison, one of the most terrifying places in all of Romania. What she endured there defies belief. Guards tied her hair to the ceiling and left her hanging until she fainted. They beat her with a shovel until her ribs cracked. Her body was covered in wounds, her scalp torn and bleeding. Even then, she refused to betray the men hiding in the mountains. For that, she was tortured again and again. Days blurred into nights, but Elisabetta never gave up a single name. The prisons where women like Adriana and Elisabetta were kept were not made to hold people. They were made to destroy them. At Mislea prison, one of the main facilities for women, nearly 400 female political prisoners were crammed together by 1954. They slept on hard wooden planks in freezing damp cells. Food was scarce, they had no heating, no medical care, and almost no light. Those who disobeyed even slightly were thrown into black rooms, tiny punishment cells with no windows. The walls dripped with moisture, and the air was freezing cold. Prisoners were often left there for days, alone in complete darkness, with only the sound of rats. And then there was Dumbraveni prison, which became a women-only prison after 1955. It held mothers, grandmothers, students, and even pregnant women. The conditions were beyond cruel. Overcrowded rooms, no hygiene, and constant beatings. Many inmates gave birth inside those filthy cells, only for their babies to be taken away moments later. The guards treated them as less than human. When Nicolae Ceausescu came to power in 1965, Romania was tired of fear. People hoped that after years under Gheorghe Dej's harsh rule, maybe this new leader would bring freedom and dignity back. Ceausescu smiled, spoke softly, and promised a better future. But it was all a lie. Just 1 year after taking power in October 1966, Ceausescu signed Decree 770. On paper, it was described as a law to protect family values. In reality, it was a cruel population control policy meant to force women to have more children. The regime wanted to increase Romania's population from 19 million to over 30 million in just a few decades. Ceausescu believed that a larger population meant a stronger country. But instead of encouraging families with better living conditions, the government simply banned abortion and contraception for most women under the age of 40, unless they already had 4 or more children. The effects were immediate. Overnight, hospitals became places of fear. Doctors were forced to act as government spies. Every month, women in workplaces had to undergo mandatory medical checks to prove they weren't pregnant or hiding an abortion. If a woman missed a period, she could be called in for questioning. Some were interrogated by police right in front of their coworkers. Hospitals had to report any suspected abortion cases to the Securitate. In rural areas where healthcare was already poor, the situation turned tragic. Women who didn't want more children had nowhere safe to turn. With birth control banned and condoms almost impossible to find, many turned to underground abortion networks. These were not clinics. They were dark rooms, often run by untrained women using dirty tools or toxic chemicals. Thousands of women died from bleeding, infections, and poisoning. Their deaths quietly recorded as medical complications. By the late 1970s, hospitals across the country were full of women suffering from botched procedures. Doctors were powerless to help. If they were caught treating a woman after an illegal abortion, they could lose their license or go to prison. Many had to choose between saving a life and obeying the regime. For women who survived, the scars never healed. Some were left unable to have children again. Others suffered chronic pain, depression, or trauma. But no one was allowed to talk about it. The topic was forbidden in newspapers, schools, and even hospitals. Pregnant women who did follow the law didn't have it easy either. The state demanded births, but gave almost nothing in return. Food shortages were common throughout the 1970s and 80s. Mothers stood in long lines for hours to buy milk or bread, often fainting from exhaustion. In factories, pregnant women were expected to keep working until the day they gave birth. Many fainted on the job. Some were forced to deliver babies in unsanitary hospital rooms, where there was no heat, no clean water, and no medical supply. By then, Romania had become a country where fear lived inside every home. People spoke in whispers, afraid their own walls might be listening. The Securitate had built one of the largest spy networks in the Eastern Bloc. It was said that 1 in every 40 Romanians reported to them in some way. Every apartment block had someone who listened. Every factory, office, and school had an informer. For women, this constant surveillance was especially terrifying. They weren't just being watched for political reasons. Their personal lives, bodies, and even pregnancies were under control. A woman who said she didn't want another child could be accused of being against the state. Even small things like a quiet complaint about food shortages or a joke about Ceausescu could destroy a life. When a woman was suspected of disobedience, she could be called in for questioning. Inside the interrogation rooms, the goal wasn't just to get answers. It was to humiliate and break her spirit. Women were strip-searched, shouted at, and insulted for hours. Some were threatened with rape, others with the safety of their children. Many were beaten until they confessed to crimes they didn't commit. It didn't matter if the charges were false. What mattered was keeping everyone scared enough to stay silent. The punishment often spread to families. If a woman was married to a man accused of speaking against the regime, she automatically became a suspect too. The wives of dissidents were fired from their jobs, kicked out of universities, or sent away from cities. Their children were bullied at school and told their parents were traitors. Homes were bugged with listening devices, and mail was secretly opened. Families lived under invisible chains, unable to speak, unable to trust even their friends or neighbors. At the same time, the terrible effects of Decree 770 were becoming impossible to hide. Hospitals and orphanages were overflowing. Tens of thousands of babies had been born into families too poor to feed them. Some mothers, desperate and exhausted, were forced to give up their newborns to state institutions, believing they might have a better chance there. But the truth was far worse. Inside these orphanages, conditions were horrific. Thousands of children lived packed in filthy rooms, with too few caregivers to look after them. Malnutrition, disease, and abuse were everywhere. Some children were tied to their beds to stop them from moving. Many never learned to speak or walk properly. By 1989, there were over 100,000 children in these institutions. Women were trapped in an endless circle of suffering. But as the years passed, small acts of courage began to grow. Some women resisted in ways that seemed small, yet carried huge risk. They hid illegal leaflets under floorboards, slipped handwritten letters to the outside world, or met secretly in churches to pray for freedom. Every prayer, every note, was an act of defiance that could cost them their lives. Faith became a secret weapon. In places like Dumbrăveni and Mislea prison, where many female political prisoners were held, women found strength in their belief in God, even when everything else was taken from them. At night, when the guards made their rounds, the prisoners would whisper hymns so softly that only those closest could hear. They made tiny crosses out of scraps of thread, wood, or bread, hiding them inside their clothes. These small pieces of faith gave them hope. Among these brave women was Elisabeta Rizea, who had already suffered once for helping anti-communist partisans in the mountains. In 1961, she was arrested again. This time, her punishment was even worse. She was beaten until her knees shattered, and she could never walk properly again. Yet she never betrayed anyone, not once. Even as she grew weaker, she held on to her dignity. When she was finally released in the mid-1960s, she returned to her home in Domnești. Her body was broken, but her spirit wasn't. Villagers said she never stopped speaking her truth, even knowing it could bring her trouble again. There were thousands of such women who suffered and died without recognition. Some gave birth behind bars, holding their newborns in cold prison cells before being separated from them. Others died from infections after endless beatings. Some elderly women starved to death, and their families were never told where they were buried. By the end of the 1980s, life in Romania had reached its breaking point. The country was falling apart under Ceausescu's rule. The economy had collapsed, and the government tried to pay off its foreign debts by cutting back on almost everything people needed to survive. Food was rationed, shops were empty, and people waited for hours just to buy bread, sugar, or oil. Electricity was turned off for long periods every day. And during the freezing winters, families sat in the dark, wrapped in coats and blankets, trying to stay warm in their own homes. While ordinary women struggled to survive, Ceausescu and his wife Elena lived in a world of luxury. They built massive palaces, threw grand parties, and filled their homes with expensive furniture and imported goods, things most Romanians could only dream of. Elena, often praised by the regime as a mother of the nation, became a symbol of arrogance and corruption. The gap between the rulers and the people grew too large to ignore. But even in this darkness, people began to whisper quietly at first, then louder. The fear that had controlled Romania for decades was starting to fade. Anger was replacing silence. The country was ready to erupt. By December 1989, those whispers turned into shouts for freedom. In the city of Timișoara, protests broke out after the government tried to arrest a local pastor who spoke against the regime. The people had had enough. Women and men flooded the streets together. Some women carried their babies in their arms while shouting for justice. Others threw stones at tanks. For the first time in years, fear no longer ruled them. The Securitate tried everything to stop the protests. They surrounded the streets, fired into crowds, and dragged people away in trucks. Hundreds of men, women, and even teenagers were killed. Their bodies were secretly taken to hospitals and burned to hide the truth. But people found out. The killings only fueled more anger. Within days, protests spread to Bucharest and other cities. Crowds filled the streets shouting for reform, waving flags with the communist symbol cut out. Ceausescu appeared on television trying to calm the nation, but the people booed him. Even soldiers began turning against him, refusing to fire on their own citizens. Chaos swept the country. On December 25, 1989, Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu tried to flee by helicopter but were captured by the army. Just hours later, they were put on trial, found guilty, and executed. After more than 20 years of fear, the dictatorship ended. Suddenly, violently, and forever. For many women, that day felt like justice. But for others, especially those who had lost children, suffered in prisons, or lived through hunger and fear, no execution could erase what they had endured. After the fall of Ceausescu, Romania began to uncover the pain it had hidden for decades. The walls of silence finally started to crack open. Old prisons like Jilava, Pitești, Mislea, and Dumbraveni were open to the public. What people saw inside was shocking. The cells were dark and damp. Rusted chains hung from the walls. Iron beds with broken frames still stood in corners. And on the walls were scratched messages. Words of hope, prayers, and names left behind by prisoners who never made it out alive. It was as if the walls themselves had been keeping their secrets all those years. In 1992, a TV series called Memorialul Durerii, the Memorial of Pain, brought these memories to life. The program showed interviews with survivors of the communist prisons. One of the women who appeared was Elisabeta Rizea, who told the country what she had gone through. Her body carried the scars, but her spirit was unbroken. Millions of Romanians watched in silence as she spoke. Many cried. For the first time, the truth was no longer hidden, and people began to understand just how cruel and inhuman that era had been. Historians soon started documenting everything they could find. They dug through old archives, interviewed former prisoners, and collected letters and documents that had been locked away for years. What they discovered was heartbreaking. Between 1948 and 1989, thousands of Romanian women were imprisoned for political reasons. Many were tortured and beaten, accused of crimes they never committed. Some died in silence, their names erased from records. Their families never told what happened. For many years after the revolution, people tried to move on. The country was poor and struggling, and most didn't want to relive the pain. Talking about the past felt too heavy, but some refused to let it be forgotten. They believed that if the truth stayed buried, history could repeat itself. As time passed, more researchers and survivors began to share what they knew. They found evidence that many women who were arrested had no official record of their imprisonment. Some had simply disappeared, taken away by the Securitate and never seen again. Families searched for them for years, but their names were nowhere to be found. Others who did survive came back to a world that no longer welcomed them. They lived in poverty, avoided by neighbors who feared being associated with enemies of the people. Even though the dictatorship was gone, the stigma still followed them.